so you're all mic'd up.
Okay, great. So welcome to the afternoon. Actually, I guess it's the last session of the conference. And up next we have someone who I don't need to introduce at all, Matheus Grasselli. He's been a regular here at the conference, I think, from the maybe one of the only other than Bruno and George that's been here to every single one. And also from a sister institute, in a sense, at Fields, the deputy director there, and has been pushing the math finance agenda very well. And Matheus is at McMaster University. Today he's going to tell us about inequality in monetary dynamic macroeconomic models. So please, Matheus.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, George, and the other organizers. Any of them here? No, none. But I guess that gets recorded.
That's not fair with George.
He was just out. Yes. So it's the end of the conference. You're tired. I'm tired. So the talk is not going to be very heavy. It's going to be a discussion essentially of a book that came out in 2013 in France and then was masterfully translated to English in 2014 by Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century. And it's a book that, undoubtedly, you can agree, you can disagree, but it made a profound impact in economics in the past few years. And anybody somebody has reviewed the book and expressed an opinion on it, and it's right on the wave of what I think is the most important issue of many both advanced and developing countries, which is income and wealth inequality. And it generates passion. The people who just found that the book was the new coming of the New Testament or something, and others that just think that it's the work of devil. But I read and I enjoyed reading, and I thought that there's something, if I can say something reasonably meaningful with mathematics about the book, why not? So this is joint work with Gaël Giraud. I think it was Chris Rogers who once told me, you need to get an economist as a co-author, because otherwise nobody's going to be paying attention to you. So Gaël is a prominent French economist, and he wrote one of the most comprehensive reviews of Piketty's book. He's now the chief economist of the Agence de Développement Française, and is also a CNRS and the Centre d'économie de la Sorbonne, right? Yes, typical French has too many jobs and affiliations. I met Piketty earlier this year. The Institute for New Economic Thinking, which is this think tank or research institute funded by George Soros and others, has a plenary conference every year. And this year was in Paris, and Piketty was one of the guests of honor. And the French people know how to throw a party. I thought that I would never be in a more glamorous session than when Nicole had her conference there a few years ago, and she and Nizar treated us to a closed session of the Musée d'Orsay. The banquet, the conference dinner was at the Musée d'Orsay, and I thought, wow, I will never top this, ever. And then a year later, the INET does their conference in Paris, and we had the entire Opéra Garnier closed for us, paid by George Soros. And when you walk inside the Opéra Garnier, and the reception for the conference, we're sipping champagne and eating foie gras and discussing income inequality. I mean, the joke, the joke writes itself. So the book opens with, this is a statement that comes quite early in the book. I call it the opening salvo. To put it bluntly, the discipline of economics has yet to get over its childish passion for mathematics and for purely theoretical and often highly ideological speculation at the expense of historical research and collaboration with the other social sciences. And I thought, whoa, this is going to be fun. Starting like that, it's going to be great, because I agree with almost every word in that statement. And then even before reading the book more thoroughly, I found, in some websites, some discussions about the methodology of Piketty. So what kind of guy is he? He's a highly trained in the French tradition in mathematics. I went to MIT, did economics with the likes of Olivier Blanchard and so on. But then he decided that, that was not the kind of research that he wanted to do. He wanted to do things that are grounded on data. He wanted to have a completely, more, as he says there, historical perspective of the discipline rather than the abstract mathematical models that economists are so fond of. So this is an explanation of his methodology given by somebody else, a philosopher, Dan Kervick. So he says, it's not a deterministic system from which to attempt to predict all future economic history, but rather a system of interacting mathematical regularities. Now, regularities are different from theorems and axioms, and patterns, themselves directly measurable from statistical analysis of historical data, and try to extrapolate to make some predictions for the future. Now, if you attended my mini course on Sunday, that's exactly the type of thing that I'm trying to do. You look at empirically measurable things, not things like utilities or abstractions of behavior, but actual regularities in the time series that you see, and then you just need to choose which time series are important to analyze, and then build a mathematical model out of that. I think that's how economics should be done. Anyways, enough for just the preliminaries. So what does he do in the book? So let's see a little bit of the key definitions. And the notation, I tried to have a mixture of my own notation that I presented in the mini course and the notation that he uses in the book to make it a little bit consistent. So Y is total income, which by an accounting identity is equal to total output. If you have a closed system, the income of the entire population is equal to the expenditure of the entire population. Now, the total output, he separates in the book, total income and output, separates into two components. The income that comes out of labor, that's W, that's wages, and everything that comes into compensation. And the income that comes from capital. So essentially, how do you derive the income that originates from capital is whatever is left after you take away labor. Okay? Then the rate of return of capital is how much income you got. So these are annual flows, so to speak. So Y is the GDP per year. So this is going to be some amount of money that you make out of capital in 1 year, and you divide by the total value of capital. So K is the stock of capital, not the flow, and then you multiply it by the current price, and then you have the value of capital. So income divided by what you have is the return made on capital, and you calculate that year by year. Alpha, as he calls in the book, and I put alpha K because I have alpha in some of my models too as the rate of productivity growth. So to distinguish from that, I'm just putting a subscript K. Is the capital share of total income, so what proportion of income is coming from capital. So that's 1 minus the labor share, or the wage share, which was a variable that we were calibrating extensively in the models that I presented on Sunday. The Goodwin model and all the extensions of the Goodwin model are all about a cycle for wage share. And then you just do 1 minus the wage share, you have cycles for the capital share. And finally, beta, which is the capital to income ratio, or as I call it in the mini course and in the models that are going to appear, the capital to output ratio. Okay, so that's just a fixed notation. But then immediately after doing that in the introduction, he goes on the substantial part of the book, which is the description of the data. So he really worked for more than 15 years with co-authors. Saez is another co-author, meticulously assembling a time series for these quantities. And you might think, okay, but you just open the NIPA, National Income and Project Account in the United States, and you have all that. Yes, you have it now, but he did it from the Romans to now for many of these things. And when it was not available from antiquity, it was from the 1700s. So this is the type of scale that he's interested in. And if you've been following the models that I was presenting for the last couple of editions of this conference, when my graphs have time scales, they are 50, 100, 150 years. So it's exactly in the ballpark that Piketty is interested in too. So, for example, what about output growth? So if you compute total output year by year, you can see by how much output grows in year by year. And you see that it was very low for most of human history. And then something happens after the Industrial Revolution. And of course, output growth increases. But the key point is the extrapolation here. It's going down again. And of course, this is all observed rates. And how does he get the extrapolation for what output growth is going to be? Is because now this is a little bit of theory. So to do the extrapolation, you need to have some theory. It's, where does output derives its growth? Well, it's from the growth of whoever is making stuff. So it's population growth. And how much is made by each person. That's productivity growth. So you add the population growth and the productivity growth, and you have a ballpark. Of course, there are going to be fluctuations because of stuff, but that's a rough ballpark of growth in output. And then there are very good estimates of what, if not productivity, because that's a little bit more abstract to define productivity and to see if you can measure, but to know what it's going to be in future years, you need to make some assumptions. But population growth, the population demographers have a very good handle of what population growth is going to be. And he just, extrapolates and states in the book that it's going to be very hard to achieve output growth of the type that prevailed after the Industrial Revolution and for most of the 19th and the 20th century. Okay, what about the return on capital? So again, that's not the theory of return on capital. You can try to derive from neoclassical principles what this ought to be, but this is what it is. You got to just measure and see what the return on capital is, and it's surprisingly regular. You would think from theory that there's marginal decrease in returns and so on and so forth as capital increases. He says, whatever is going on, it's not affecting the return on capital. And he has a very comprehensive definition of capital. It's not just productive capital, stuff that is inside factories and so on, but he includes land, and in the historical case, he includes slaves, for example, in the United States. That's all capital, and in more modern times, human capital, intellectual capital, and so on and so forth. And the return on this is surprisingly robust and constant throughout his time series. Now, there's a spike here, and he says that this bit here is the exception. But then, okay, and then we'll be more or less at about 4% going forward. You might agree or disagree, but that's his extrapolation. Because you can, for what he calls pure return on capital, he subtracts the compensation of managers of capital. So subtracts the salary of fund managers and things like that, or the equivalent people back then. So anybody who works in the business of managing capital and have their own compensation, you subtract that from the return on capital and you get the pure return.
Because they're not really making anything.
That's right. Okay. What about the capital share? So the capital share, remember, is the proportion of income that comes from capital. Income is divided into capital income and labor income. So it moves. It's cyclical. Okay? And if you remember the type of graphs that have been shown for a long time, like in the Goodwin model, the wage share moves like that, and the capital share is 1 minus that. So it's going to move like that too. This, by the way, is not in any model of mainstream economics. DSG models don't come up with that kind of result. This kind of endogenous cyclicity of both labor and capital share. So you could tell by how I got excited by reading the book. I started to look at these graphs and say, I've seen this before somewhere. Okay. What about the capital to income ratio? So this is, again, how much capital there is in the economy divided by the output, the yearly output. Okay, so you're comparing the total amount of capital and what's made in a given year. And he says that, it went down for a while, and the reason it went down here is because of wealth destruction, because of the two wars and the recession, the depression that wiped out capital from existence. But for most of his time series, capital to income ratio is quite high, and for example, of the order of 7. And it's growing. And again, he says, this bit here was the exception. We should expect capital to income ratio to be a lot higher. Okay. And now, so 12 out of the 16 chapters of the book or something is data. And then he does a little bit of theory. And when he does the theory, it's like this. He calls something the first law of capitalism. And remember, alpha is the capital share. So how much of the income goes into capital. So it's just like that, but then you multiply and divide by the total amount of capital, and here you have the return on capital, and then the capital to output ratio. So here's his law, that the capital share is the return on capital times the capital to output ratio. Well, it's an accountant identity. It was a trivial identity, but he calls it a law. Okay, fair enough. The second law of capitalism is that the asymptotic of the capital to output ratio converges to the saving rate of the country, so that is the part of income that is not consumed, is the part of income that is saved, and then being saved, it's reinvested, divided by G, which is the growth of output itself. And now for this, you need a lot of theory to justify, and the theory that is behind that is entirely shaky. It's things like the solo growth model. It depends on all sorts of unrealistic assumptions that we're going to be criticizing in just a moment. So the first is obvious and true because it's an identity. The second is likely not true. But they are his two laws of capitalism. And then based on these two laws, he says, therefore, if the return on capital is greater than G, wealth and income inequality tend to increase in time. And you look at that and you think, okay, how? So this reminded me when I read of the, have you watched the South Park episode about gnomes and how gnomes have this fantastic business plan to steal underwear from kids and then make profits? So the kids in South Park need to make a presentation about this business plan from gnomes. And it goes like this. Phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit. So that's Piketty's conclusion. You have his laws of capitalism, question mark, increase in inequality. So I'm entirely unconvinced by the argument, and I'm not the only one. So the book received criticism from left and right. Why is that there? Oh, yes. So not only, yes, the equivalent for him of profit is to make a very strong statement at the end of the book. He goes, the inequality argument of G implies that wealth accumulation in the past growth more rapidly than output and wages. This inequality expresses a fundamental logical contradiction. The entrepreneur inevitably tends to become a rentier, more and more dominant over those who own nothing but their labor. Once constituted, capital reproduces itself. So he's good with words. Faster than output increases. The past devours the future. Okay? Well, not really. I mean, what does it mean that R is greater than G? Yes, the return on capital is higher, but then you need to determine what do you do with that return on capital. For example, if you consume all, then you're not going to be reinvesting that in capital. So there's no reason why the capital to output ratio needs to increase just because. So you have the rate of return is not the same thing as the growth rate of the thing that you're computing. And several other flaws in the argument are like that. And many people pointed this out, including Gael in one of his papers. So the criticisms are, the validity of the second law of capitalism. If it's only valid if saving rates and growth rates are constant, but what if, as the world starts to have lower and lower growth rates, why is it immediately obvious that the saving rate is going to continue to be the same way that it is? If you're producing less things, if you have less growth in output, saving is what makes you build capacity to build stuff. But if you're building less and less stuff, you're going to be saving less and less. So, there's no reason for these things to be constant and asymptotic. They can adjust as time goes by. The relationship that R is greater than G, it's a historical regularity, but what if capital grows too much? Then you might wonder if issues of marginal productivity of capital would imply that this rate would be going down in time. The Cambridge capital controversies, which is the analog for this debate on capital of the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem, which has to do with aggregation of preferences. In here is aggregation of types of capital. So to deduce the theoretical rate of return on capital, you need to be able to measure capital first. And to measure capital, you need to add together the value that capital ought to have to say what the value of the return ought to be. You need to discount the future products of these different machines. But to discount, you need to choose the discount rate, which is going to be the rate of return that you're trying to calculate. So there's an issue of how to bring these different types of capital together for heterogeneity. So this was a deep debate in the 1970s between Cambridge, the UK, with people like Caldor and John Robinson, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, so the MIT. People say that time is a device invented to prevent things happening all at once, and space is a device invented to prevent things happening all in Cambridge. And the use of representative agents, so this is what is at the core of the Solow model. It's kind of bizarre to have a book dedicated to inequality whose foundational model has just one agent. Think about that, right? How do you talk about inequality? So it's a bit like, but this is the type of bizarre things the macroeconomists do all the time, for example, to talk about unemployment when there is only one agent. And you know how they define unemployment in a model with a representative agent? It's time that you don't work. That's the fraction of your time that you don't work is corresponding to the proportion of the population that is unemployed. And then you need to justify that you don't work because it's better for you not to work. So it's leisure. The value of leisure is better than the value of work. So that's what Paul Krugman rightly ridicules, that you need to accept that the Great Depression was the Great Vacation. People just decided to take a break, okay? So here's more or less the same thing. To define income inequality, now you need to think of the one representative agent having the two types of income, and then a fraction of the representative agent dominates the other factor. It's bizarre. Nevertheless, so it has all this criticism, but what about the thing that he's trying to show? The thing that he's trying to show is that capital as a fraction, as a proportion of, the ratio of capital to income is increasing. That's what his argument is trying to lead to. Well, this is what's is happening in the data. For most of human history, going from year zero, the return on capital has been fairly constant and much higher than the growth rate. There is an inversion at the time when there was destruction of capital, but the destruction of capital, he says, was an accident. It's not the fundamental dynamics of capitalism. So he says that his inequality, R greater than G, is actually realized in the data, regardless if you think that his theory is shaky. But this was all to build up to the argument that this is what he wants to show that is happening, and it is happening. So, as time goes by, this is the share of the, top 1% in the United States. So share of top income as a proportion of income. So the top 1% now, they have as high a share of income as in any time in history, since the time series that he could construct. The top 0.1% is even more scandalous. The top 1% in the United States have, almost 10% of the share of total income. This is for income. Then wealth is like that too. That's the top 10%, and that's the top, top 10% and then top 1%. So the top 10% own almost everything, 80% or upwards of 80% of the wealth in most rich countries. So there's, even if the theoretical argument of the book are all wrong, there's something that needs to be explained. And the purpose of today's talk is to try to use the type of models that I was using before to see if we can say something. Yes.
You're saying that the top 1%.
Yes, that's this.
In the US has been about flat around 30% of the wealth, and in Europe, in Europe it went down from half of the.
That's right.
The total
Yeah,
wealth
to about 20%, and now it's slightly going up.
Yeah,
Yes.
This is a major evolution.
Yes. That's why the book was so powerful, because it shows this data
No, but this goes on the contrary. Again, this more goes like reduction of inequality.
This, of course, was a reduction. But he's saying that the trend is to go up to what it was. Nobody wants to go back. This is what he calls patrimonial capitalism, where, and then he gives examples in literature, it's populated with quotes from Balzac and so on, that it was taken as a fact of life that there was this class of rentiers, people who do nothing but just live off the capital that they have and collect rents. And, several distinguished characters in literature are just like that. That disappeared. Keynes thought that there would be the death of the euthanasia of the rentier. Well, they're coming back. That's his point. And without active policy prescriptions, and then he gives it at the end of the book, he says that the natural law, based on whatever arguments he has, is that this is going to go up again, and we're going to have a society that is dominated by people who own stuff and do nothing. So it's the dominance of capital over labor. And one of the most shocking graphs is this one, is the fraction of a cohort, so there's a different cohorts, people born in different years, what fraction of it receive inheritance that is equal to 50% to the labor income of a lifetime for 50% of the population. So again, to read this, so in 1970, 12% of people received inheritance equal to the lifetime labor income of half of the population. And it's going up. Okay? Of the 10 richest people in the United States, 7 had their wealth from inheritance. And that kind of thing. It's all over the place in the data. Okay, so that's the tour of the data and the introduction of the book. And as usual, I spent too much time. But I think it's important to establish what we're trying to show. So how are we going to do that? So we start with this thing that I now call the dual Keen model. So you heard me talk about the Keen model ad infinitum. So you're all bored of that. But I want to put a twist now. So the key for the Keen model is that the engine of decisions is investment by firms. And if firms want to invest more than they make in profits, they go and borrow. So the debt dynamics controls the asymptotics of the model. Now, in households in the original Keen model play a passive role. So households eventually adjust to whatever is left of total output. So output Y is investment plus consumption. In the original model, all the action occurs in investment. Consumption is a buffer variable. Now I want to move things around. I want consumption to be the engine of the model, and investment is going to be a buffer. So in other words, in this type of model, firms are sort of on-demand producers, and very good on-demand producers. They will invest as much as necessary to satisfy the consumption of the households, okay? And not more and not less, and they'll adjust very, very well to that. So it's just type of the dual model than what we've been talking about for a long time. This is the stock flow consistent formulation of it, as usual, with the different types of assets. This is what determines capital, by the way, in Piketty's book. And because financial assets, even though you can measure them, when you do it for the entire economy, they cancel out. Somebody's asset is somebody else's liability. It's only real capital and things like houses and slaves and so on, and bitcoins. Somebody asked during the mini course, what about bitcoins? Yes, that's part of that type of capital. Bitcoin is not a financial asset. It is not a liability of a government. It's a stupid thing, but it is a real capital. Anyways, said enough about bitcoins now. The transactions between the different sectors, every plus compensated by one minus, and you know the story. And the way to derive models is to look at the flow of funds. So after everybody does their transactions in a given sector, they'll have some amount of money left over they need to distribute within the assets that determines a coupled system of differential equations. And the model is then derived from these differential equations. So very well. In the original model, the key variable, the key dynamic variable was the debt of firms. Here's the debt of households. So when households increase their debt, when they spend, so they spend on consumption and on repaying debt more than they earn. So if they spend more than they earn, then their debt goes up. Now you define consumption itself as a function of the disposable income of the households. It could be an increasing function, could be a convex function, or whatever, of the disposable income. We're going to modify that a little bit later to include wealth, because that will make a difference in the model. And here's the thing that I said, investment is the buffer. It adjusts to what consumption is. Therefore, the evolution of capital is determined by the underlying variables in the model. And you can have a constant capital to output ratio to simplify there. So, of course, Piketty wants the capital to output ratio to increase in time. We're not there yet, because if you want to put non-constant capital to output ratio, then you need to get into issues of capacity utilization, when do you use capital to produce, and so on and so forth. That's one of the extensions of the model. I want to capture here today just what debt can do to inequality. So not the part of Piketty's argument that capital to output ratio has to increase, because that was just an empirical fact, but it's used to show that inequality increases. But if we can get increase in inequality without it, then all the better. Okay. So what do you have to do about wages? Now, wages are bargain between the workers and the firms, and the higher the employment, the higher the bargaining power, but they're also affected by, this should be, I is the same as P dot over P, so I should have deleted I. Either use I or P dot over P, okay? So there's a typo there. So the bargaining is affected by the perception that workers have of inflation. They try to bargain for higher salaries if they perceive high inflation. And gamma is the parameter that controls what economists call money illusion. So how well you bargain for your wages based on your understanding of prices in the economy. And prices themselves, they adjust to costs. So they track the cost, and the cost is because it's for final products, the only cost is the labor cost. So if prices are such that they are well below labor costs, then they go up. If they're well above cost, then they go down. So it's kind of a lagged exponential adjustment to costs with a markup, and the markup is M. Is by how much profit you want to make. It's just a target. You don't actually reach it, but firms have a view of how much they want to achieve in profits, which, by the way, is the realistic way of setting prices, instead of just saying that their prices are things that make marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. No firms set prices by that, or their prices are the mechanisms that clear markets. Apple doesn't set the price of iPhones to clear the market for iPhones. Apple tries to set the price of iPhones to see how much profit they make. And they don't clear the market. They acquire and destroy inventory. So the fluctuation occurs in quantity and not in the price. Prices fluctuate much less than economic theory would have you believe that they fluctuate. Okay, and then you put this all together and you have the three-dimensional system as in the King model, except that now the underlying variable is the debt of households and not the debt of firms. And the analysis goes on exactly as in the King model. There are two types of equilibria. There's a good equilibrium when debt goes to a finite value, finite ratio, with income the economy. But there's a bad equilibrium when debt, which is the third variable here, goes to infinity, and wages and employment go to 0. Okay, very good. So you can have that, but now I want to talk about inequality. I haven't talked about different types of households yet. So what I'm going to do now is to separate the household group, the household sector, into 2 classes. And I'm going to make the assumption here, which is not too far off the mark, that the households are divided into households that own nothing and households that don't work. So it's going to be divided between workers and investors. How realistic is that? Well, this is a rewriting of some of the data that we've seen before, that, the top 10% have 76% of all the wealth. If you go a little bit more, then you have practically all the wealth in this class of investor household, not workers household. And then the bottom actually have negative net wealth because they have debt. So they don't own wealth, but they have this liability, and that's what I'm going to be doing. So now, instead of just one debt, there are 2 debts. And so debt of workers and debt of investors, and there's wealth of workers and wealth of investors. Workers, as I just said, they only have a liability. Their wealth is minus the amount of debt that they have. The investors, they have assets as stocks that they buy. They invest in stocks, and they have their loans minus deposits. That's their net debt. The change in debt of the workers' household is as it was before, is what they consume plus what they pay in interest minus the wages that they receive. For the investors, they don't receive wages, but they receive the capital income, because now they own the shares that are the titles to the capital, so they receive dividends, and dividends are given by the return on capital times the amount of capital. So this is the earning of the investors, is what Piketty says is the class that doesn't work, but just collects the rent. So the dividends are the rent for owning the capital. And then, crucially here, we are going to have consumption now that depends on both income and wealth. Because you can depress consumption of workers if they have a lot of debt, and you can increase consumption of investors if they have a lot of wealth. So it's not just a function of income. And workers have a higher elasticity of consumption than investors with respect to wealth, because, with income, because the income is low to begin with. So, Bill Gates, by doubling his income, is not going to be buying twice as much goods. That's the point. So now it's a 4-dimensional system with debt of both workers and investors. And as in the original system, it also has a good and a bad equilibrium. In fact, a bunch of bad equilibrium. And the point here is that at the good equilibrium, the income, so you can calculate the evolution of income for the income for workers is wages, and the income for investors is capital income. And you can calculate on the path of the good equilibrium, and as it converges to the good equilibrium, the income ratios converge to a constant. However, in the bad equilibrium, you can guess what happens. All the wealth gets concentrated with the investors. All the income goes to investors because the wage share gets depressed to 0. That's the characterization of the bad equilibrium in the Keene model. So if the wage share goes to 0, then evidently the income ratio goes to infinity if you do investors over workers. You can do a little bit more. You can introduce speculation in the choice of how much the rich households buy into stocks, so the proportion of the wealth that goes into stocks, by have a sort of endogenous dynamics of this investment proportion, which depends itself on the expected return on wealth. And the expected return is sort of an adaptive expectation type of thing that tracks the real return. So here you have a bubble mechanism that is common to this type of models. And what happens here is that you put that back in the original model, and remember there was the good equilibrium, the bad equilibrium. The speculation makes the basin of attraction of the good equilibrium even smaller. So now there are more initial conditions for which you're going to have divergence of income. And I'm coming to the end with a little bit of further work that we can do. We can do a default, because some of these workers can default, and even the investors can default before these things reach infinity. And there can be some sort of social migration. So this clear separation of workers and investors. There can be some sort of dynamics of mutation in this class, so that some workers become investors and some investors lose all their money and become workers. So that's what we're working right now. And I think that's it. So thank you.